There are very serious problems in Scottish education in virtually every aspect of schooling. But the Scottish Government can't deal with everything at once. They've got to target their attention on the most serious issues first and try and get those sorted out. And so they've targeted a particular issue here, and that is to try and ban blazers in schools. I mean, this document is quite bizarre, so let's have a look. This is from Jenny Gilruth, the Education Secretary. Let's start reading some of the SNP babble here. School uniform is a barrier to participation and engagement for some pupils. For example, some pupils, such as those with particular health conditions or those who are neurodiverse, may find it challenging to wear certain types of clothing or materials. Other pupils, such as those from a particular faith group, may feel that uniform restricts their identity and individuality. Now, let's just clarify here. The whole point of school uniform is to restrict individuality. It's to take away individuality and promote collegiality, promote a sense of unity and community. That's the whole idea of it. But that's not in the political ideology of the SNP. It's all equality and diversity, etc. So that's the philosophy they're coming from. Let's have a look at some of the key principles. School uniform policy should be informed by the views of pupils. Well, I'm not so sure about that. Part of the idea of uniform is that a new pupil comes along and the message to them is, the tacit message is, welcome to this school, you've got to fit in with our standards. These are our standards, you have to fit in with them, and that's the deal. And that applies to uniform, but that also applies to doing your work, behaving yourself, etc. It's just an important part of the ethos. It's part of establishing basically who's in charge in the school. So you don't get to choose what you want to wear. You have to wear what the school says you are to wear. So it's an important underlying disciplinary factor, I would say, of making it clear that the school has authority over the pupils while they're in school. But the SNP is obviously not keen on that at all. The pupils should have a view on whether or not they have to wear uniform or what they should wear. Not so sure. Right, more of this sort of vacuous babble. This uniform's got to support an inclusive, welcoming and equitable school culture. Inclusive, we'll come on to what that means a bit later, like with transgender, for example. Equitable, that means everyone ends up the same outcomes for everyone. So if some schools have blazers and some schools don't, well, that doesn't seem very equitable. So the SNP's got to deal with the alleged problem. School uniform policy should promote equality, including recognising specific matters relating to religion and belief, race, disability, sex, sexual orientation, gender reassignment, and pregnancy and maternity. So school uniform policy should make provision for pupils who are pregnant. Now, obviously that situation might arise. Now, I don't think it's particularly difficult to deal with that situation in terms of school uniform. But the idea that the Scottish Government is saying to schools, you need to have a uniform policy that makes provision for pupils who are pregnant, well, that's a sign of the times. Maybe let's just put it that way. And the last thing they say, school uniform policy should continue the position of no legal requirement upon pupils to wear school uniform. I mean, how ridiculous to be highlighting that. I mean, that is just providing ammunition to every barrack room lawyer in a school in Scotland. You're not wearing uniform properly? I don't have to. There's no law that says I have to wear my uniform properly. You've got no right to make me do that. You can't do that. I can wear what I like. And the Scottish Government wants to give that pupil, as I say, that ammunition, feed them their lines in order to be stroppy with the teacher over not wearing uniform. I mean, basically, if pupils are going to be told, by the way, the school can't make you wear uniform, it's time to give up, basically. I mean, another way of looking at this is, like talking in maths class when the teacher says, you need to be quiet now and listen to what I'm saying. That's not illegal, but you still have to do it within the school. But this is not made clear to pupils. So the message that pupils will be getting here is basically the school hasn't got a leg to stand on. Ultimately, if you push this all the way, they can't make you wear uniform. So why not do it? I mean, counterproductive or what? Right, they're talking about trying to reduce the cost of uniform. This is a big problem. But there's grants available. Minimum £120 for a primary school pupil. Minimum £150 for a secondary school pupil. Now, I think the idea that parents have to spend a little bit of money on school uniform, if the pupils to go to a certain school, then they send them off on the first day looking very smart and proud that they're going to this really good school with its high standards and smart uniform. Now, the SNP wants to do away with all that completely. Yeah, I think the idea of parents having to pay a bit, I say it's positive. It also puts the parents in the frame of mind as well, that they've invested in the pupil going to that school to some degree. Now, if people can't afford it, well, there's these grants, isn't there? But, well, the SNP is not happy. Now, what have we got here? What have pupils told us is this section. So it's about listening to pupils. So pupils have said they also thought that there should not be negative consequences for those not wearing uniform, recognizing that the reasons for this might be out with their control. Okay, right, when I was teaching, the routine thing would be, boys would try and wear the wrong colour socks or wear items of jewellery that were not allowed in the uniform policy. And so you say to them, right, that's not uniform, change them. Pretty straightforward. And it'll be the sort of thing where, kids being kids, they'll be a bit rebellious and they'll try it on from time to time. But as far as I'm concerned, if kids want to be a bit rebellious and try it on, then the colour of their socks is a pretty good place to do it, because it doesn't actually do them any harm wearing the wrong colour socks. I think if they get away with it in the longer term, that does them harm, because they're learning that you can live in defiance of the standards of the organisation they're in. You can defy their authority, and that's just fine. So in long term, that's not a good message. But obviously, wearing the wrong socks short term doesn't do any physical harm to the pupils. Lots of other things pupils might do in a rebellious phase actually are quite risky in terms of long-term harm. So having a uniform policy to rebel against, well, actually that can be quite positive from that point of view. But the pupils say there should be no negative consequences. Negative consequences, that's maybe what used to be called punishments, or it might be something like you need to go and get changed, or if you don't turn up in these things tomorrow, we're going to turn you away. So if there's no negative consequences, how's this to be enforced? Well, basically it's not going to be enforced. So it's just going to deteriorate and deteriorate. The poor old teachers are going to be dispirited by having to say, look, that's not uniform. This is the uniform policy. You need to wear the right things. And the people will say, well, okay, so what? What are you going to do? And as far as the Scottish government is concerned, what should happen then is, well, nothing. The teachers can maybe say, please, it would make me happy. I really would like you to. But if they don't, nothing happens. So taking that on board, that basically there should be no punishments, no negative consequences, that is effectively abolishing school uniform. School uniform just becomes a request, and it's not going to be too long before that just fades away and the schools give up on it because it is unenforceable. Right, what have we got next? Right, this is from the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion considerations. It says include gender-neutral options and give pupils a choice of what they wear. Now, it's interesting in saying about gender-neutral options, because according to this policy, every item is gender-neutral. Every item on the list can be worn by boys, girls, and whatever else they think exists in Scottish schools at the moment. So when they say gender-neutral options, I don't really know what they mean, because everything is gender-neutral as far as they are concerned. Right, next thing, affordability. Branded items of uniform and blazers should not be compulsory, nor promoted or encouraged by schools. So basically, you can't have blazers, or you shouldn't have blazers on your uniform policy. But if you can't promote them or even encourage them, I mean, what can you do? Just say there are blazers. Does that not promoting them? So if you say there are blazers, if you want to wear that, then obviously the fact that you've made the option available implies that you think it's good for some people at least to wear blazers. So this guidance basically says to schools, you shouldn't have blazers as part of uniform policy. This guidance equally applies to independent schools. Now, of course, the government say this is not the law. So schools can defy this. So an independent school can still have blazers as its uniform. We're not making them doing it, making them stop that. But when it comes to inspecting that school, don't be surprised if you're criticised for having a non-inclusive uniform policy. And the inspectors will go into schools, they'll go to Fettes College, say, and say, how do you feel about being made to wear a blazer? And lots of pupils will probably say, yes, fine, actually, quite like it. Yeah, it looks smart. Yeah, no problem. But they'll find one somewhere. They'll find some, I say, sort of stroppy barrack room lawyer type who will say, oh yes, I don't like it. I feel whatever. They'll complain about it one way or another, and that will be what gets quoted in the inspection reports for these schools. So independent schools with your smart pupils and blazers, well, I think you might be facing some problems in the future. Right, next thing, the uniform policy should avoid specifying the style of items unless there's a practical reason which supports safety, health, or well-being. Now, let's just have a think about that. So if you specify, say, black trousers, but you can't specify any more than that. You can't specify the style. I mean, you can have some pretty wild interpretations of black trousers. They could be full of holes, frayed around the bottom, crazy, baggy denim. I mean, who knows? Who knows? But the implication of this guidance seems to be any style is acceptable, which just makes a mockery of the idea of a school uniform. Right, we're on to the section about sex now. Schools should design and implement gender-neutral clothing and uniform policies that support participation and inclusion for all pupils. In other words, there's no uniform for boys and girls. Boys and girls can choose from any item. These policies should recognise and challenge the impact of harmful gender stereotypes. In other words, the fact that a boy can wear a skirt, well, that's positive because that's tackling harmful gender stereotypes. I would say it's promoting gender confusion among some of the boys who might be vulnerable in that regard. Right, the guidance said they should avoid gendered assumptions about the type of uniform that is preferred and promote flexibility and pupil choice. Promote flexibility. So it should be made absolutely explicit that boys, if you want to wear a skirt, that is absolutely fine by us. I mean, imagine the conflicts that will cause. When some boys will say, I'm going to wear a skirt, the school will say, yep, that's great, we're absolutely fine with that. Don't anyone dare tell you that there's anything wrong with that. Whereas at home, they're thinking, oh no, what is going on here? This is the last thing we want. We've really got to steer our son in a different direction. So the school and the parents would be pulling in completely different directions there, which is what the government wants. As far as the government is concerned, the parents are wrong, the school's right if they're following their guidance. So it's as simple as that. Right, so schools should be mindful of language used when implementing uniform policy with individual students. For example, schools should avoid using language such as modest or decent, as these terms are stigmatizing and only applied to girls and young women. How about that then? Now, you have probably observed, as I have, that when you see female pupils going in and out of Scottish schools, they're often wearing the most ludicrously short skirts you could imagine. I mean, yeah. Is that appropriate for school? Absolutely not. Would that be appropriate if you were working in any sort of work context? Almost definitely not. Almost definitely not. And so the schools obviously realise that this is not right. But basically they haven't got the authority, the power to actually do anything about it. So the schools just put up with it. So if a school were to say, or a teacher with a pupil were to say, right, that's what you're wearing, that's not on, you need to dress modestly and decently. The Scottish government is saying, don't you dare use those sexist words. But I think that is exactly the issue. A lot of girls going to school in Scotland are dressing immodestly. Sometimes out of the intention of trying to attract the boys or whatever, or following fashion, or just following the crowds, doing what all the other girls do. But I think those words are absolutely appropriate. And I think girls and boys, but girls in particular, need to realise that the way that they dress has an impact on the way that boys are going to react to them. So if you dress in a way that's designed to be alluring to boys, then that there's absolutely going to be fruit from that. It's going to be attracting attention, maybe unwanted attention in some ways as well. And that's just not what school is supposed to be all about. So that is, just, again, feminist dogma gone mad, saying the school shouldn't insist on modest or decent dress. So the school can say, you have to wear a black skirt. A black skirt is an option on the uniform list, but you effectively can't say anything about how long it needs to be. But modesty, decency, because that will be out of order, according to the Scottish Government. Right, supporting transgender pupils in school. Right, this is just quoted from their previous guidance. It says, forcing transgender young people to wear clothes which do not match their gender identity can be distressing for them and may constitute discrimination under the Equality Act 2010. Man, how I get fed up of hearing about the Equality Act. It just gets quoted as meaning you'd better follow our progressive ideology, or maybe somehow you might be breaking the law. We don't need to actually pin down how, but it'll just scare you enough and make sure you do it our way. And that's what the Equality Act is all about. That's why the Labour government in 2010 passed it. One of their last acts was to make sure that even when there was a Conservative government, still sort of left-wing progressive ideology would prevail in our society through the threat of this law. Now, the Conservative government, actually, they needn't have bothered, because the Conservative government carried on in exactly the same vein pretty well. So that's a bit of a threat. So if you say to a boy, basically, you shouldn't wear a skirt, then they're saying you could be breaking the law. Schools should not exclude transgender young people because of how they dress, unless it breaches health and safety regulations. If your school doesn't have a uniform policy, it should be clear that young people can wear what they want, including skirts, trousers, shorts, regardless of gender identity, as long as it complies with school guidelines. So they want to make it absolutely clear, basically, boys can wear a skirt to school. Now, to my mind, the idea of having a uniform for boys and a different uniform for girls is very positive, because it makes it clear to every pupil at the start of every day when they're getting dressed that they're a boy or a girl. And through the day, there's no confusion about it. You're a boy or a girl. That's pretty straightforward. So I think that is strengthening gender identity, and it's combating gender confusion, which is rife in Scottish schools. So I think the idea of having gendered school uniform is actually very positive, but the Scottish government thinks it's an evil that's got to be tackled. Right, how about this then next? Preventing hair discrimination. Now, when I was teaching, the school had a hairstyle policy that was enforced fairly strictly. Certainly no dyed hair or too short or too long or various other things were banned. So basically trying to get a professional, reasonable, serious, industrious ethos within the school, rather than it feeling like a fashion show where people are competing with all sorts of crazy hairstyles, which is just not what you want in a school. The Scottish government thinks differently. Not all schools will have a policy for hairstyles or head coverings, but where they do, this policy should be flexible, inclusive, and support the needs, circumstances, and identities of all pupils. It should be gender neutral, support pupils to feel comfortable with their natural hair, and respect their rights to express themselves through their choice of hairstyle. So in other words, to sum that up, you can't have a policy on hairstyle. If you've got to respect the right of pupils to express themselves through their choice of hairstyle, how is that possibly compatible with having any sort of hairstyle policy? So if your pupil turns up with green spiky hair one day, well, obviously you can't do anything, because that would be infringing their right to express themselves through their choice of hairstyle. Again, totally counterproductive. I mean, the Scottish Government's attitude could roughly be summarised as to look at the schools in Scotland that get the best exam results, maintain the highest standards, look at everything they do that's distinctive, and attack it. Stop them from doing that. Right, it gets even stranger here. It's important that teachers and school staff are supported to recognise and understand the links between different hair types and styles, race and cultural identity, and the potential for hair discrimination in uniform policies. It's good practice for schools to provide training for staff on the need to foster good relations and eliminate unlawful discrimination and harassment related to hair as part of public and grant-aided schools' obligations under the public sector equality duty. Schools could also support this by organising activities to promote equality and diversity. For example, activities that include black role models and celebrate afro-textured hair. I mean, for goodness sake, what are they talking about? So you're going to invite someone in to speak in assembly because they've got frizzy hair. I mean, it's bizarre. That's another insight into Scottish education. What we've got there, of course, is the equality, diversity and inclusion agenda driving everything else. To academic standards, ethos, etc., they're not really interested in that. They're interested in promoting their own political ideology through the education system, and the consequences, as we all know, are disastrous.